remobilize and reinvigorate the debt movement with national civil society as well as the citizens at the national level. So I'd like to call onto the stage here Ms. Bertha Phiri, who is the Executive Director at the Malawi Economic Justice Network, Mr. John Maketo, who is the Head of Programs at the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, Ms. Diana Gishengo, who is the Executive Director at the Social Institute for Social Accountability and the coordinator of the Okoa Uchumi Coalition in Kenya, Mr. Isaac Mwaipopo, who is the Executive Director at the Center for Trade Policy and Development in Zambia, Mr. Martin Sonkeu, who is the General Coordinator of the Africa Development Interchange Network, and Monsieur Jean-Pierre Degu, who is the Executive Director of Social Watch in Benin, if he's here. Please, you're all welcome. Let's give them a round of applause. You take that one there. I'll take this one. Yeah. Okay, so thank you all very much. This session is going to be relatively, we'll try and keep it short to about 60 minutes so that we also finish on time. But really, just before coming to Dakar, the idea around having the remobilizing theme of this AfCODD was to ensure that we also had a deeper understanding and appreciation of what was happening at the national level. Many of our countries are suffering with a very deep debt crisis, which is not just due to the borrowing that they're doing, but is also being exacerbated by the policy responses that many of our governments are taking. Directly linked through the tax policies that are being advised to them by their development partners, which further, increases the cost of living. It further deepens the inequality that is currently being experienced in many of our countries. Furthermore, in a space that is constantly and consistently shrinking, activism and advocacy on issues of public finance and debt in particular are becoming extremely sensitive topics to discuss and to have conversations with government. But nonetheless, many of our partners at the national level have managed to brave and weather those storms and continue to mobilize civil society, mobilize citizens, journalists, and members of parliament to force this conversation because it is very important. And so with that, I want to start on my far left with Bertha. In Malawi, the situation, I remember we were there for AfCODD II last year, and just very soon after that, there was a very deep impending crisis where the country nearly collapsed because of the inability to pay its fuel bills. And even though it was able to secure an IMF program, things have continued not to stabilize and is now again on the brink of not being able to satisfy some of its creditors. When we had the meeting in Lilongwe earlier this year, just before AfCODD III, what are some of the things that were coming up out of that meeting, and how do they resonate with what we've heard here today?
Thank you so much. Many thanks indeed to the question, Jason, and thank you for this opportunity, really. Once again, my name is Betha, and I'm from Malawi Economic Justice Network. Primarily, this is an institution that envisions Malawi citizens that are treated justly and that they live a dignified life. And we do this through advocacy, research, and capacity building. Now, bringing it down to the question on the table, what are the emerging debt issues that were transpiring during the National Conference of Data and Development in Malawi. Really convened under the theme within the 4 Rs, and particularly on reshaping the development destiny of Malawi. There were a lot of issues that kept coming, but key to it is the fact that Malawi debt crisis is actually posing a significant threat to the Malawi's economic stability and also the development aspirations themselves. We came to realize again that the reduced development spending in the key sectors and critical sectors of health, education, infrastructure, but also poverty reduction efforts. There is literally little investment towards that because government is actually grappling to service the high debt cost. Much more alarming is the little investment towards the national agenda, the Malawi 2063 vision. And again, secondly, to my point is that we also realize through data and aid department that Malawi is losing its credit worthiness, implying that the challenge around accessing the international capital market for favorable markets is actually a tall order in the country. It is actually losing that credit worthiness. But all this are summing up or actually alluding to the fact that Malawi has always been over-dependent on its donor support, which actually at times becomes unpredictable, but also comes with a lot of conditions that cannot actually tally with the status quo. And then lastly, to this question, we came to realize as a national partner that there is actually a weak institutional oversight function. At the time we were gathering already, we learned there were some loan authorization bills that were to be tabled without proper scrutiny and even proper engagement with the parliamentary committee responsible. And so the weak regulation or weak oversight institutions that were actually premised within the issues that came out. Much more the development partners that constituted the CAPS, the Common Approach Budgetary Support. Why? Because all this, like I already alluded to, is actually as the consequence of the withdrawal of their support. And critical to it, we are saying the commercial banks, they are the ones that also we need to target. Outside targeting the parliamentary committees, the commercial banks remain very key to the process because at large, the domestic debt is actually with the commercial banks in Malawi. But going forward, the aspect of monitoring for future loan contraction remains key for the CSOs in Malawi. What we are saying, we would want to venture into a complete or advocacy towards complete reshuffle of debt contracting process. In this regards, we would want to dive into the amendment of the standing orders of Parliament that provides extensive consultations to the CSOs and local Malawians in the process. Lastly, just so let me indicate that the concept of citizen engagement and the social accountability monitoring remains key for the CSOs in Malawi, particularly through the national conference outcomes that we came across with. Thank you, and let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Bertha. And I think this is a good point to segue to John in Zimbabwe, just across the road. The last point that Bertha mentioned, and I know it's very relevant to the meeting we had, about rethinking or reshuffling the debt contracting process so that there is more public participation. In Zimbabwe, over the last couple of years, there have been some positive signs where, you know, the civil society groups have taken the Ministry of Finance to court and received some very positive responses from the court, and in terms of debt transparency. how, with the ongoing arrears clearance program also that is being discussed and negotiated, how do we use this opportunity with the national debt meetings that ZIMCOD has been organizing to ensure that we continue to empower the judiciary, but also ensure that the arrears clearance program is not sidetracked by other processes that are currently ongoing?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jason, for that question. And to thank you for the highlights you just gave, Beth, as well. So in Zimbabwe, the debt question remains one of the key economic reforms question. With regards to debt contraction, there's been a lot of lack of transparency around that, and most of the times Parliament engaged as a post de facto incident, mostly to rubber stamp when loans have already been acquired. And this is one of the things that ZIMCOD took the Minister of Finance to the High Court against, to ensure that there is an alignment of the Public Debt Management Act with the Constitution, because the Constitution provides that all loans must be approved by Parliament prior to contraction. But the Public Debt Management Act was guaranteeing different provisions, allowing for the Minister of Finance to actually contract loans without parliamentary approval. And so this alignment is one of the victories that we have won. So in terms of opportunities, Jason, I think that for us is to continue to engage citizens in the process of debt justice advocacy. It has to be a movement building element around this. For ZIMCOD, we did not just put ourselves on the front, but we worked with citizens. There were actually individual citizens that stood in as litigants in that particular court application that we won at the High Court, and also partnering with other organizations. Then, of course, you rightly put it, there is need for continuous engagement with relevant stakeholders to ensure that the message is put across and that there is a shared and common understanding of the problem that a debt crisis can bring about to the economy. But I need to also allude to the fact that there is an opportunity for us to continue to engage under the structural dialogue platform that is ongoing in Zimbabwe. This is our own unique process to debt resolution in Zimbabwe, and it's facilitated by the FDB president. It's also championed by the former president of Mozambique, H.E. Chisano. And the process has set out 3 matrices that Zimbabwe has to pass. And these include governance reforms, economic reforms, and the land tenure reforms. And I must highlight that there is room for us to continue to influence progress towards economic reforms, stabilizing the macroeconomic policies. And then around governance reforms, one of the litmus tests was, the conduct of free and fair elections, which the elections we just had last week. And then the land tenure reforms is around the global compensation deed, whereby there is need to compensate former farm owners and issue debt back into 2000, the year 2000. So, and also guaranteeing property rights. So there is a lot of work to be done with regards to making headways towards finding a lasting resolution with creditors in Zimbabwe. But there is room for winning and registering some milestones around that. I want to again register that in terms of debt transparency, regular, publications and information dissemination around, debt statistics has improved in Zimbabwe, and that has been acknowledged. And also, there's willingness to engage with the relevant authorities around issues of debt management. So we continue to position ourselves as a partner, as a stakeholder around that. We have also been invited several times to provide technical assistance to the relevant ministry and departments around that. But much can still be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that. And again, it's always very encouraging when we talk about fixing things from within. I know many of our speakers from Wednesday have been talking about that, and especially in very difficult environments and conditions, that there are institutions of governance that are still willing to be confident enough to stand up against those that try to pull the wool over our eyes when it comes to issues of public financial management. And I think the judiciary in this instance in Zimbabwe, needs to be appreciated for those very brave rulings that they have provided in holding the government to account and supporting civil society asks for greater transparency. And again, it's a very nice way to segue to Kenya, where perhaps on issues of public financial management, we perhaps don't have that luxury in some of our governance institutions. But Diana, the regime has been vocal in talking a very good game on trying to deal with the public debt situation in Kenya. But when one looks at the numbers and what has happened, just in 2023, 2 credit rating downgrades, a potential default of its Eurobond in 2024, and scampering around trying to raise money to ensure that they don't default. What were the emerging issues coming out of the meeting in Kenya when you had the chance to engage with officials and civil society in that sense?
Thank you very much, Jason, and good morning, everyone. The Kenyan context, as Jason has rightly put it, is this is the first year and the first budget cycle since President Dr. William Samoei Ruto took over power and promised to ensure there is fiscal discipline, act on the escalating debt, and so on. So that's the context that Okoa Uchumi, the civil society coalition in Kenya, was operating in. Just before we convened the debt conference, we received the first budget of the government and the proposals therein. No budget cuts, just another big budget. A big budget for a country that has had budget deficit over the years means more borrowing. So as civil society, we convened this particular conference against a background where we had engaged our executive, treasury, and parliament at length, and to a point where it got adversarial. I know there are colleagues here who felt wanted in Kenya for the engagement that they had with members of parliament. But we convened the meeting nevertheless, and what was interesting was, first, parliament was very keen to work with civil society on this particular debt conference. Actually, the initial plan was that we would co-convene the National Debt Conference with Parliament. Halfway, they hesitated and said, I think this debt issue affects all parliamentary committees, so you proceed, convene the first consultations, we will have in attendance our Finance and Planning Committee, as well as the Public Debt and Privatization Committee. And thereafter, come and guide us on what to do on the public debt issue. And they have kept their word. They attended the meeting, members of parliament, and they stayed throughout the session. And I think yesterday, they have extended the invite to the civil society coalition in Kenya to go and advise them on what to do on the debt question. So we expected a situation where we had punched so hard that they would have been hesitant. But there is a recognition that this is a problem that requires all hands on deck. So that's the first area. It was Parliament, and Parliament committed to a number of things. One was to lead the country in conducting a debt audit, together with the Office of the Auditor General. Few months before we convened the National Debt Conference, we had problems raised by the Auditor General that she's unable to audit our public debt because the paperwork just doesn't align. So it was very, very, it was very, very encouraging to see Parliament say they will take up this thing. I have deviated a bit, so we focused on 3 areas or 3 things. This is a mantra currently in Kenya. Our president is serious on corruption, and he's doing 3 things. You either go to jail, you go to heaven, or you go to exile. So when we convened this, we also had 3 things or 3 areas to focus. And the first one was the people. Why? Because this is public debt. It affects the people, but they do not understand. And what stood out for me from the conference were 2 participants. The first one was a young person who was fresh out of high school. She sat through the entire conference, and when plenary was open, she asked, why do we keep studying about volcanoes that will never erupt in our lifetime? Why are we studying about faults? Yet, when I finish high school, the first thing I am faced with is this reality that you people are speaking about here. Public debt, fiscal discipline, public finance management that I have never heard of in my 12 years of schooling. And she challenged all of us in civil society and in government, and we took a resolution that it is time that these discussions cannot be had when you're an adult. They must start early because the impact of public debt and issues of fiscal accountability are intergenerational. So that was a highlight and one of the things that we will carry. And the second one was a woman who runs informal trade, and she came to the conference because her business was collapsing, the taxes were too much, the government fees was too high. And then she said she came here so that she understands, but she's so lost. She's so lost because of the jargon, the vocabulary used. She has no hope of ever understanding issues of public debt, economy, and so on. And that was yet another challenge, that if we are to remobilize and lead people to rethink, then we must communicate the problem of public debt in Africa in a language that the masses understand. So that's around the people. With Parliament, what stood out was, one, the parliamentarians who came were challenged. There has been a conversation that Parliament does not understand their role. They have approved very many, all the debt in Kenya is odious and so on. So first was a parliament that now seems keen to defend their role as the holders of the government, of the public purse, of debt, and the proponents of the fact that Parliament has approved all debt irregularly, actually toned down because of the clear stances that were taken by our parliamentarians during this particular process, and a commitment to public participation, that they would moving forward ensure that budgetary processes, public debt processes would have more expansive public participation. In the end, Parliament challenged us, just like the president of Gabon, ex-president, make some noise, civil society. Things are bad. Things are really bad. So that was another highlight and encouragement that Parliament knows that we must defend the civic space when it comes to public debt. Then finally, there was consensus in the room. Look, we must move from resilience, endurance, that is brought to us by the international financial institution. We must move from structural adjustment. I think Kenya has extended credit facilities. We have a resilience fund from IMF, to conviction that IFIs do not have our interest, they do not have our solutions. That's the message that the National Debt Conference in Kenya brings to Dakar. Let us move from resilience to conviction. That the richness of the African continent must be utilized now. We can no longer be beggars. That we must be courageous enough. We took a resolution that borrowing within the East African community should take a local currency. Right now, most governments are in panic because we all borrowed in foreign currency. The currency fluctuation means we now have so much more money to pay. Before we establish the institutions that are already set out in the African Union document, can we already be bold enough to say, moving forward, or even go tell these creditors, we will pay back what we owed in our local currency then, because all this money is just reparations. You took it from us a long time ago. So you cannot now set conditions. Let us become convicted Africans, resolute Africans who know our worth and are no longer beggars, who are resilient and tolerant enough to continue being violated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana, for that. And again, a very nice way to bring in Isaac, because, you know, from one country where the IMF is perpetuating dependency and begging, to Zambia, where, depending where you sit, the IMF is being lauded as the institution that has saved the country from collapse. But Zambia is a very interesting case because, you know, like in the 80s and 90s when we had structural adjustment, Ghana was the leading light, the shining example, purportedly. Zambia is the first country to actually work through the G20 common framework and come to some partial deal with some of its creditors in terms of restructuring its debt servicing payments, but also having to implement an extremely difficult IMF program. And so to what extent, you know, building on what Bertha, John, Diana what is coming out from those three countries. Are there some similarities or sentiments that are coming out of Zambia when it comes to the issue of public debt and the role of the IFIs, particularly the role of the IMF when it comes to fiscal consolidation and austerity?
Thank you so much, Jason, for that question and in sharing the reflections from Zambia. I should be quick to mention that there are quite a lot of similarities with what is happening in countries like Kenya in terms of the problem that we are facing pertaining to public debt. And this is part of what dominated the national AfCODD conference that we convened in partnership with AfCODD more recently. And in looking at some of the key issues that came out prominently from the meeting that we held, we focused so much on reflecting on some of the experiences that Zambia has had with treatment of its debt under the G20 Common Framework. One of the key observations has been the challenge that we have had in terms of getting our debt restructured in good time. And one of the recent developments pertaining to the G20 Common Framework has been speaking to the deal that the country managed to get more recently, where part of its debt was to be restructured. That is the bilateral debt that the country has. But that in itself has not yet resolved the challenge, because we still have a significant component of our debt, which is to the private creditors, that has not yet been restructured. And as you reflect on the two components of the debt, you also realize that the bilateral option or the bilateral portion of our debt equally was resolved in a manner that still is likely to leave us in serious problems. Within the principles that have been agreed on how the debt can be restructured, there are clauses of provisions that are likely to prove problematic as we go. An example that I can cite in this platform is on our debt carrying capacity. So there are provisions within these principles that are indicating that should there be an improvement in the performance of our economy, our debt carrying capacity will actually also be changed, meaning that we'd have to increase the amounts that we're expected to pay. And from the civil society, we find such provisions to be quite problematic and not entirely sorting out the problem that we have as a country. I think the second aspect of the debt challenge in our country is the way our leaders are communicating the outcomes from the G20 Common Framework. So there is this message that is being shared with the public that seems to give an impression that our debt has been resolved. Our debt has been cancelled. And to a larger extent, what we are seeing is that this is misinformation, because our debt has not been cancelled. And we still have the obligations that we need to be paying related to public debt. And we see that as a big gap that we need to start contributing to within the work that we are doing within the civil society space. Added to that is the challenges related to the reforms that we are implementing. As you may be aware, Jason, the country is now under an extended credit facility from the International Monetary Fund, which is running for the next 36 months, which is about 3 years. So embedded within the extended credit facility are provisions that are speaking to social and economic reforms that the country needs to undertake. So on one hand, you see the language seeming the need to increase allocation of resources towards social protection. On the other hand, we are also seeing reforms that are negating some of the potential benefits that can be derived from the social reforms. Examples include reforms that have happened in the energy sector. So if you look at some of the reforms in the energy sector, they are speaking to an increase in tariffs, which makes access to electricity quite high. That is also feeding into challenges that those that are into productive sectors, local manufacturing, Because of that, it means that prices of goods would also become expensive, and that burden is ultimately passed on to the consumer. But besides that, we also have fuel prices that have been quite unstable for some time. As of yesterday, there were upward adjustments, and almost on a monthly basis, there are adjustments on fuel, which is actually making it quite hard for businesses to plan, but equally for consumers. So these are some of the issues that from the civil society we are actively mobilizing and engaging in, because we'll be on the extended credit facility for quite some time. Lastly, I would also want to speak to the burden around domestic resource mobilization. Due to some of these reforms that have been instituted as a result of being on the extended credit facility, we are also seeing the Zambia Revenue Authority struggling to meet some of the targets that are related to mobilizing resources locally. And if you look at some of the reforms, especially those that have been instituted in the mining sector, where a lot of incentives have been provided because of the program that we are on, it now makes it difficult for us to mobilize resources within to finance our development aspirations. And as a result, we are now resorting more to borrowing, even if there's a change in terms of narrative speaking to the fact that now we will not be borrowing from commercial sources. Whatever source we borrow from, ultimately it still becomes debt, and it will still fall on our books and will ultimately be expected to pay. So if you look at what is happening now, the language is shifting, and our politicians and our leaders are now emphasizing more on the need to focus on private-public partnerships. And this is now seen as an alternative model to borrowing from commercial sources. But what we are also not discussing or having a conversation around is who ultimately pay for those PPPs. Because if a road is constructed and they put a lot of toll gates, the ultimate person that will get to pay, it still falls on the citizens. So there are still big challenges related to public debt, and the work that we've been doing collectively is work that can help to continue highlighting on how government can explore alternatives that will ease the burden on citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isaac. And I think highlighting also the challenges that come with having to implement an IMF program. And I think that is a huge lesson in this room for us to take away from these past 3 days, that it's not as easy, to implement those programs as much as they are very quick to come in and be very happy to make us sign them. We must interrogate exactly what is happening when these credit facilities are being put before our parliaments and being put before our national treasuries. And there are lots of lessons of how it is, the perception that they are giving with one hand, but they are certainly taking, with the other in the same breath. Leaving also on public services, their sister next door, the World Bank, to come and pick up the pieces through their very innovative, what they call innovative blended finance, public-private partnership type approach. So, and I think with that, I wanted to bring in Martin, because a couple of years ago, we did do a documentary in Cameroon, and there was a very telling story about how a medical practitioner was giving his view of how they understand or they can see government borrowing in millions of dollars, but he had to, fuel his own little boat and go to an island in order to, and use his own money to dispense health facilities to a community. And that sort of sentiment is one that we are hearing in terms of, the debt not being felt by citizens or being felt in a positive way by citizens. The feeling it's more negative, it's extractive, it deprives us of accessing public services. So in the Cameroon meeting, what were the kind of things that were coming out in that sense?
Thank you very much, Jason. In the Cameroon meeting, one of the things that we had has to do with people's participation in how to reshape the debt management situation in the country. Because the country now is in a situation where the debt level is such that the country is at risk of debt distress. So the meeting gave an opportunity to a number of stakeholders to come together and reflect on what are the urgent things that need to be done and how this should be done to make sure that that situation is changed, and not only change within the country, but change in relation to what is happening on the continent. So there were a number of things at stake during the discussions that we had during that conference in Cameroon. So the debt management system was reviewed. That is because the country has a debt strategy, net debt management strategy. That was reviewed. And the parliamentarians' role was also put to discussion. And then the reform of public finance was on the table, because debt management has to do with that reform. And also the impact of illicit financial flow on the use of domestic resources for development. And then different stakeholders were asked to bring their perspective. What is interesting here is, and which comes to relate to what we heard from other countries, is that the parliamentarians were very keen to be part of this movement of changing the debt situation in Africa, and they took a number of commitments. And they also said they are not going to wait until something is done elsewhere before they table that at Parliament. They insisted that the very next parliamentarian session will see some of the outcome of the conference put on discussion with the government. And one key thing that emerged is the way they thought this could be done. They said this could better be done if the civil society and parliamentarian could get into a kind of affiliation or a common work framework to see how they support the government in changing the situation. And part of the discussion was also about how the people could influence this process. If a process comes to be where parliamentarians and the civil society work to accompany the government toward a better debt management situation, how would the people influence that? So a number of things came to as a recommendation on how people could influence that. I'm going to pick some of these because we shared the outcome of the conference, and I think the organizers will be able to share that with all the participants here. But I'm going to pick some of these recommendations for us to comment here. Among the things that were said should be done, they didn't just say what should be done, they also set the preconditions. That is, what are the preconditions for the things that will be done? What are the preconditions that we need to have? Now, let's go to how the people could influence any process that comes. Because I'm picking just this for us to comment. By ensuring proper supervision of public debt management. I'm picking these looking at the discussions that we had the 2 past days to see how what happened in Cameroon is in linkage with what we discussed here. And by getting involved in the formulation of a continental common position on debt management or debt reform. The civil society could collaborate with policymakers in building their capacity, because there was one of the things that came out is that there are times where policymakers may lack capacity on some of the issues that relate to debt. So the civil society should look at ways to collaborate with policymakers to build their capacity on dealing with debt issues. Then, the civil society should also continue to push for the enactment of laws on illicit financial flows, and also should do something to make sure that anything at continental level which has been initiated is really implemented. So these are some of the things that came out of the conference. And you can see that these relate very much with the discussion that we had the 2 last days. And another thing that came out is that they said this is not just about debt management per se. It also has to do with the way we organize our economy in terms of transforming the economy and get things better so that we balance our system before we see how we improve on it by recourse to external resources. So these are some of the things that came out of the conference in Cameroon, and we could discuss more.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. Jean-Pierre, in Benin, we've heard also very much about the role of public participation, the importance of linking the issue of public finance, public debt with the impacts it has on public services. But also transparency and governance is also something that has emerged in some of the discussions and presentations we've heard just a few moments ago. In the case of Benin, is that something that is also important, the role of good governance, the role of public participation in policies, in the making of policies, in the advising of parliaments? Is there that appetite and demand coming from policymakers and parliamentarians to seek the opinions and the recommendations of civil society actors and activists so that they too can be part of this policy-making process in a way that ensures prudent utilization and management of public funds? Are those some of the things that resonate with the discussions that are going on in Benin and during the Social Watch meeting?
Merci. Le cas du Bénin